He was a man of great barbarity towards all men equally, and a slave to his passions, but above the consideration of what was right. Yet he was favored by fortune as much as any man ever was. For from a private man he became a king, and though he were encompassed with 10,000 dangers, he got clear of them all, and continued his life till a very old age. But then, as to the affairs of his family and children, in which indeed, according to his own opinion, he was very fortunate, because he was able to conquer his enemies, yet, in my opinion, he was herein very unfortunate. These are the words of the great historian Josephus writing about our number three villain, Herod the Great. Welcome back to the So We Speak
That's
podcast. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined by Terry Fakes, and we are getting into the real villains here on the podcast. Herod the Great's probably on top of everyone's list.
He's probably one of the better known villains of the Bible. I think probably people that, whether they're even Christian or have ever read the Bible, may very well have heard of Herod the Great, whereas Haman and Sennacherib maybe a little more questionable in terms of their popular in the popular imagination. But Herod the Great is a villain, as you were mentioning before our podcast today. He's a villain in more than one way. You know, we saw Haman was a personally evil guy who did evil things. We saw Sennacherib, who certainly wasn't a pleasant guy, but is mainly known for the evil things he did. And as you listen to Josephus, you get the impression that Herod was an evil individual who also did very evil things.
Yeah. Now that we're getting into the list here, it's interesting to kind of compare our people, and of course we'll do this of our next two as well. But Herod is interesting to me because if you imagine our other two villains, without the Bible, we wouldn't know anything about Haman. We would know things about Sennacherib. Without the Bible, we might be convinced that Herod was a great figure of history.
Right. That's very true. He's known, he's called Herod the Great, not because of any nobility of character, of course, but in those days, the great was often given to people who built infrastructure. And Herod was indeed a great builder. Now, where did he get the money to build? Off the backs of his people and off of oppression. But history's come to know him as someone, as time, you get some time and distance, as somebody that left remarkable monuments. And I'd say that's probably not the best way to judge Herod. Herod was indeed a remarkable individual with a lot of skills. He was born, just to give you a frame of his life, he was born in 73 BC. This is during the lifetime, for example, of Julius Caesar. And he died in 4 BC. So he lived through a lot of Roman history. He lived through a lot of what was going on in the Middle East. But he basically came to power in Judea because of a friendship with Mark Antony, who during his war with Octavian, who would later become Augustus, he convinced Antony that he should be king of Judea and that he would send a lot of tax money so that Antony could build his armies. When he became king, it took him 3 years to kill all of his enemies with the Roman troops that he had with him. So he killed all of the former nobility called the Hasmoneans, Jewish people who had been ruling Judea before the Romans got there. He just brutally wiped them out. At the same time, he married a Hasmonean princess, Mariamne. So Herod was trying to hedge his bets. He said, I'll marry into the dynasty and I'll kill anybody that could be my rival in the dynasty. So you can understand how pretty early on Herod was not particularly well loved.
Yeah, there's two features of Herod here that I think you need to understand to get what kind of person he was and what his reputation was at the time. First, as you mentioned, he doesn't have a legitimate claim to be the king of the Jews in the sense of like a hereditary monarchy. That there
Right.
is a powerful ruling family called the Hasmoneans, and he is in some ways usurping their authority. So on the one
Hmm.
hand, Herod essentially rises to power from being a nobody, from being kind of a local warlord, to being the king because of his brutality and his ability to gain favor with powerful people in Rome. So from the get-go, you see that his appeal, his authority is all outside of Israel. He does not have any
Right.
popular base in Israel that want him to be king. All of this is coming in from the outside, which is one reason he's so hated as as he comes to be by the time the Bible story kicks off in the New Testament. But the second thing is he is seen as somebody who is not religiously up to par among the Jews. So if you look at his background, his family is not Jewish per se. He's an Edomite, an Idumean on his dad's side, which, if you remember from the Old Testament, is the wrong side of the family tree of Abraham. They live kind of south of the Dead Sea. They are not people in the Promised Land. And then on his mother's side, he's what we would consider to be Arab. She's a Nabatean,
Right.
and
Right.
they're a very powerful group of people in the first century. They're spice traders. They rise up and have a pretty powerful army in the second century BC. But they too are not Jews. They're not people of God. And so what happens is you have his father forcing, basically converting through force. His mother is not even remotely what you would want in a Jewish ruler. And he's trying for his whole life to prove that he actually does fit the bill of being a good religious Jewish leader.
One of the things in the New Testament that's a clue to this, Cole, is you have the Pharisees who are pretty religiously devout, and then we have the Sadducees who are less religiously devout. They're a little more secular minded. And then there's this group that you'll see in the New Testament called the Herodians. And these are Jews who are emulating Herod, meaning they're Jewish, but they want to integrate all of the Roman and Greek customs. So you get this sense that the followers of Herod, or those emulating Herod, were the least religiously devout of the Jews.
Right, right. And if you think of Herod as a person, as a figure of history, this explains a lot of what he's trying to do. On the one hand, he needs to keep an appearance, at least, of being a Jew.
Right.
And that's, we think of it, we think of today, your ethnicity, where you're from, all of that are one thing, your religion is another, kind of what you do is another. These are all different things. But for them, this was really more of a package deal. Who you were,
Hmm.
what your ethnicity was, your background, your religion, your social status, all these things were mixed together. So on the one hand, he needs to create the image of being a good Jew, worthy to be a ruler to the Jews. And then on the other hand, he needs to continue to please and placate his Roman patrons by being kind of a man of the world as
Right.
well. And I think the easiest way to see this is in the great building projects that
Right.
Herod undertakes.
That's exactly right. Let's just take the first one. He's known for Herod's temple. So this was a play to get the Jews to love him, uh, but his motives were completely different. So, for example, he comes in and he says, "Look, we've had this refurbished temple that the Babylonians destroyed it in 586. Jews come back, build a small temple. It's nowhere near as nice as Solomon's." He said, "Look, let's build something at least as nice as Solomon's for our God." I mean, he's just cloaking himself in this. Well, when you get started, he does a remarkable feat of engineering. He builds the Temple Mount, and then on top of it, he builds a temple that is grander than Solomon's temple. So, on the one hand, people say, wow, look what he has done for us and our religion. But Cole, I would argue that his major motive is he's trying to modernize his kingdom, and he wants the temple of the God of his kingdom to be equal to the temple of Jupiter in Rome. In other words, this is an ego thing for Herod, masquerading as a religious thing. And I think the temple is probably a great illustration of those two things coming together inside Herod.
It's a shrewd political move because on the one hand, he is playing to his base. They want
Hmm.
a grand temple. He's able to cloak it in kind of religious piety. He wants to build a great temple for God, and he does. I mean, it is the envy of the world. It's a greater temple than any other temple in that day. I mean, it's magnificent. And so he accomplishes that for the Jews. And at the same time, you have this belief that basically the gods are regional. You can worship multiple
Right.
gods. They have these kind of regional power bases. And so saying something about the Jewish God, like that temple would say to the world, actually also says something about Herod to the rest of the
Right.
world. You know, he comes from
Exactly.
this area. That God's very powerful. Whoa, look at the big temple that Herod's built. Look at all the riches, all the gold. He must be a highly favored kind of guy.
That's true. And you know, you see that ego in the temple, but you see it even more in some of his other building projects. Just a few miles, not very far at all, from Jerusalem is what's known as the Herodium or the Herodian. There were two small hills there, and he had his workmen, his slaves, chop off the top of one of them to build the other one up taller. So now it is the striking feature of the whole landscape. It's by far the tallest hill mountain around, and built a fortress at the top, but also it was palaces, swimming pools, that kind of thing. And so the Herodian is a monument to his ego. He does the same thing at Masada. He takes that and rebuilds it, and it is a magnificent fortress, but it also has swimming pools and spas and that sort of thing. Caesarea on the sea. I'm just reeling these off. You've been to all these places. He goes to Caesarea, Cole, and this one is, to me, is really striking at the level of his egomania. He goes to Caesarea and he says, "Look, I'm so rich, I've got to have a port, a good port to ship all of this in and out, all of these materials out to the Roman world. And there isn't a good port. So you know what? I'll make a port." And he literally constructs a harbor with magnificent engineering. He sort of makes something in nature that isn't there. He feels like he is so powerful, he can even shape nature to his will. So, all of these building projects, as magnificent as they are, and they are indeed in terms of engineering, are incredible monuments to his ego.
Yeah, so the harbor and the palace that he builds at Caesarea later on, we don't have time to tell this story, but we've told it in other podcasts. After the Herod family fizzles out later, you get a Roman governor over
Right.
Judea, which is where Pontius Pilate is stationed. They want to live in the palace that Herod builds in Caesarea. And that's how lavish this place is.
Hmm.
And it is an amazing work of engineering. I think the book that wasn't written, I mean, everybody was writing about Herod and the Caesars and all that, but the book that wasn't written that would be really interesting is who were these engineers that Herod was
Exactly.
using? I mean, these people were unbelievable in these building projects. I mean, even to the point that today it would be hard to build the Temple Mount. It would be difficult to build Masada. It would be very difficult
Hmm.
to build Caesarea on the Sea. And he really left his mark there, whether he had been a religious figure or not. He would have been known in the ancient world as a great builder. The thing that kind of puts him on our map as a villain, though, is his personality. He's got one of the biggest and most evil personalities at this point in history.
He really does. And, you know, I think that it is this unique combination of, first of all, he's very talented, which, if you're going to be evil, makes you at least an effective evil person, which it magnifies the bad deeds you can do. But it's a combination of his great ego and his great paranoia. He knows that he's only there to at the behest of the Romans, and so he needs to keep them happy. He needs to keep the money flowing. He's constantly bribing politicians in Rome and currying power. He never feels secure. At the same time, he knows that deep down, none of the Jews accept him or like him, and if they could, they would probably rebel and kill him. And so you have the ego, and at the same time, you have this incredible paranoia. And we do indeed see that in all the things he builds. They're great palaces, but they're also hidey holes. They're fortresses where he could hold up for a long, long time if his people rebelled against him. And I think those two things come together to make him uniquely cruel and uniquely evil.
Yeah, like many people that gain as much power as he has, he's constantly watching his back. He is worried that people are plotting against him. Probably people are plotting against him.
Right.
We see this in his own family, in the people that he has charge over, in the high priest. I mean, all of the people that get close to Herod are constantly being changed out because he would be incredibly difficult to live with. He's a total egomaniac, but also he doesn't allow anybody else to gain very much power. And
Right.
that sets the backdrop for the biblical portrayal of Herod, which people are probably familiar with. In Matthew chapter 2, you get three narratives about Herod right in a row. The first one is the visit of the Magi. So the Magi come, they go to Jerusalem because they're looking for a king. They say, "Where's the king of the Jews?" And Herod's ears perk up immediately, thinking, "What do you mean, king of the Jews? I'm the king of the Jews. There's no other king of the Jews. I haven't had any
Right.
kids recently." And as you know from the story, they get word from an angel not to go back to Herod. He tells them he's going to go worship, but they realize that actually that's not what he wants to do. And so they go back another way. What we also know is that Herod's own court scribes tell him the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. And that's where the Magi end up going. So Herod understands that God is doing something here. This is prophecy that has been
Right.
fulfilled. This is a move of God. This might be the Messiah. That's what all Jews are supposed to be looking
Hmm.
for. The problem, though, is if the Messiah shows up, he's going to say to Herod, "You're sitting in my seat." And that's not going
Right.
to be good news for Herod. So Herod sets himself up not just against Jesus, this at the time a
Right.
baby that he doesn't know if he will or won't be the Messiah. He sets himself up against God himself, against his own word, by the verification of his scribes. So after this is when we see Herod really start to make our list as a villain. He decides, after the Magi leave, he decides that he's not going to take any chances. He's just going to have all the children, all the males that are under 2 years, put to death in the entire country so that he can make sure the Messiah does not live to adulthood. Of course, the great irony of this story is he is doing exactly what Pharaoh had done. Pharaoh is another one of our arch villains.
Right.
Um, he has done exactly what Pharaoh has done. He's trying to stamp out the people of God, but it's worse this time because these are his own people. These are the people he's supposed to be leading, and he's killing all the young males so that nobody can threaten his power. What's ironic about it though is Jesus and his family escape Herod, the new Pharaoh, by fleeing to Egypt. So they go down to Egypt. They wait. The third little narrative set in Matthew chapter 2 is that Herod dies, and an angel comes and tells Joseph it's okay to go back. And that's when they move up to Nazareth, where Jesus is going to grow up. So you don't get a very flattering picture of Herod in the Gospels, but you do get one that's actually very consistent with what we know through
Right.
Josephus and other accounts. Very powerful, very paranoid.
You're right. You were talking earlier about this dichotomy. Herod, in his mind, sees himself in the mold of King David. He is a great leader of the Jews, putting them on the international stage. Herod sees himself as a leader, in the type of David. But in reality, in killing those children with his ego and his oppression of his people, he's actually a leader in the type of Pharaoh. And his end will be more like that of Pharaoh than it will be of King David. He, and not only does he kill the innocents, he kills so many slaves in these building projects. He has no consideration for them. And you think about it, why would he? He killed his beloved wife, Miriamne, and by all accounts, he really did care for her. But he thought she was involved in a plot, so she had to go. He killed her mother at different times. One of them right before he died, just a few days before he died, he killed three of his own sons. So, when you think about that, the level of personal cruelty rises to a height of villainy that puts him on our top five list.
Yeah, he's on the level of like a Nero in history in
Right.
terms of kind of deranged, paranoid. I mean, he's married at least 6 times, and it takes him until his third wife to not kill all the kids eventually and not either exile or execute his wife. I mean, this guy is absolutely crazy. And that level of cruelty, if you can imagine that he's doing that to his family, what's he doing to everybody else? I mean, what's he
Right.
doing to his people that work for him, the slaves that he forces to build, palace guards, all of these things? I mean, you get the sense of a person who has no regard for human life. And his end is very fitting for a person like that. We've kind of picked up the theme here that in these great villains, you're going to see the provision of God, and of course, you see the provision of God in the life of Jesus. He's supposed to be killed like Moses. He's going to be a
Hmm.
savior of his people on a grander scale than Moses, and God saves him through protecting him from the edict of Herod or of Pharaoh. You're also going to see this person meet their end in a way that kind of is fitting for their life. Sennacherib killed by his sons worshiping his God after threatening Israel's God. You know, Haman, the ultimate irony, he's hung on the same gallows that he's constructed for Mordecai. You see this play out in these stories. Herod also has an end that's kind of fitting for his life.
According to Josephus, first of all, his end was physically very painful. We do not know what killed him. It could have been some kind of cancer, but it appears to be something abdominal. It appears to have caused him great amount of pain. He lingered for quite some time. But in addition to the personal pain, the physical pain, he also was alienated from family, as you can imagine. He knew that his subjects would be happy when he died, and so he enters his last days lonely and isolated and in pain. And Cole, he comes up with, according to Josephus, he comes up with a scheme to make sure that people are unhappy when he dies.
Yeah, he decides that when I die, who's going to cry at the funeral is basically the
Hmm.
the problem that he's dealing with. So he decides in kind of an ingenious, dark way that he's going to kidnap a bunch of the very powerful people in Israel. So you're going to kidnap them, and then when he dies, he gives the order to his guards that they're to kill all of those people as well. And then there will be great weeping and sorrow at the death of Herod in Israel.
So they round him up and they put him in the big theater. And Herod, nearing his end, had told his sister, "Yeah, execute this. The moment I die, kill them all, so that when the news comes of Herod's death, everybody will be crying." So Herod died. And of course, they decide, well, Herod's gone. We don't want to start off with ill will. So they let everyone go. And so I hate to say poor Herod because he deserved the end he got. But in the end, the man who thought that he could had enough power to shape nature to his will couldn't even execute his final wish, and no tears were shed for Herod.
Yeah, Herod he meets a fitting end. He tries to kill off the Messiah. Of course, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, lives far beyond Herod. He dies as well and rises from the dead. Herod himself dies. He is buried in this very lavish tomb on the side of the Herodian. And it wasn't until relatively recently, within about a generation, that anyone even knew where he was buried. We
Right.
had records of it that he was buried at the Herodian. People thought maybe it was down in the middle or the bottom or up on top of the tower, but actually it's up on the side of the hill of the Herodian. And shortly after Herod was buried, people came in and robbed the place and smashed his tomb. And now it's reconstructed now. You can see it. It's really interesting to see how he styled himself. But not even a monument was left to Herod, just the ruins of his great building projects and the record we get in the New Testament and in Josephus. So, the end of another villain. We have two left, and we'll cover our next one, the biggest, baddest villain of the Old Testament, in the next So We Speak podcast. We'll see you then.